Turn-based combat. Oh, how you remind me of my grandparents, viewed by most as old and irrelevant, but I still love you to bits regardless, or at least that's what I thought. I confess, guys, what's good? How you all doing? That I reached a point, I even did a video on it in the past, where I expressed doubts that turn-based could or would ever return to Final Fantasy, because there's this old age debate going on of, has this system become outdated? Has it, truly? And could it still reach the lofty heights of 7 million and beyond sales? Typically the number that Square Enix require for their AAA budget games these days, when the latest of generation of gamers have never even touched a turn-based game, and frankly, just doesn't look as flashy in trailers. I mean, let's be real here. Turn-based is fun as fuck when you actually play it, but at first glance it can seem either slow-paced, boring as shit, or so overly complicated most newcomers don't want to even touch it with a barge pole. And yet in spite of all of this, I've had a change of heart. Now, I'm going to explain why I think Square Enix, they might, as crazy as this sounds, had one too, and that turn-based could be returning to this series sooner than you think. What I want to make clear from the very go is my love for this combat system has never dampened. I love it, I'm addicted to it, I personally want to see it back. I know that not everyone agrees with that, and despite being previously doubtful of its viability to return on a AAA scale, which, I mean, frankly, who could blame me? Especially when it comes to Final Fantasy, with FF16 removing itself entirely from turn-based, and hell, when even the Final Fantasy VII remake, when even a remake of a game that originally featured turn-based combat puts the middle finger up, the message doesn't get much clearer than that. Square, despite being the innovators and the forerunners of this classic combat system that so many fans are craving the return of, Square doesn't have confidence in it. Now, this isn't some crybaby complaint about either of these games. I am by no means one of these people who demand that every FF must be turn-based, or it's not an FF. My favourite combat system, after all, is Type 0. So I'm not one of those people, but would I be lying if I said I'm glad these games aren't turn-based anymore? Yes, I would. Because the truth I've always maintained is the potential of turn-based combat, it hasn't been fully explored. Square Enix, they were the kings of turn-based, and with every iteration we have seen, we saw the system evolve. I think most people envision turn-based returning as being 4 stationary characters in a line, waiting upwards of 15 seconds before one measly arse attack. But with the character quick switch function in 10, the really evolved, fleshed out team builds and grids, I mean, regardless of what you think about FF13, it definitely brought a far more pacey and engaging speed to turn-based combat. Title by title, we have seen Square Enix find new, ingenuitive, fresh ways to keep the system relevant, and to say it now can't be evolved any further, that it's hit its maximum capacity, that seems very narrow-minded to me. Because while I admit turn-based as we once knew it on a AAA console, size and scale, sure, that might be dead, but that doesn't deny that with new mechanics exploring countless, that I can even think of off the top of my head, hybrid possibilities, or even with just enough polishing, turn-based could be just as relevant and sell just as well in the Final Fantasy series. And I'm going to address the very obvious elephant in the room. Persona 5, the P5 card is coming out. This title alone has probably what's single-handedly converted my own rather, what I will admit was a cynical outlook on turn-based combat the most. And it genuinely was just a cynicism that Square were aiming for 10 million sales with FF15, and now could that really hit that? Now, the first thing we have to address on that front is FF15 didn't actually hit 10 million sales, it hit 6.5 million in its first year. Now, I know Persona 5 hasn't sold around that 6 to 7 million mark, but it has sold 2 million at this point. 2 million. That number is no joke. We can't overlook that, and I think I've been proven wrong. Because the simple fact is, if Atlus, who are much smaller, way smaller, with way less resource and money to throw around, and Persona itself, a younger franchise with way less games, way less fans, and infinitely weaker brand recognition and weight behind the name of its title, if that is able to creep on Square's arse to that close a margin and to have honestly put Square Enix, I'm gonna say it, on the back foot in the whole JRPG genre as a whole. And I know I'm saying that as the Final Fantasy peasant, and you guys know I love 15, and I even love things like 12 and 14 that definitely departed from turn-based. It's clear to me that if Atlus are able to reach these kind of records and successes and achievements with such a weaker brand running about as traditional a turn-based system as it gets. Again, it had really cool new mechanics. Persona 5 was very ingenuitive and it had a lot of new nuances to its system, but overall it was a traditional turn-based system. If they can do it, it's clear to me at this point the debate isn't that turn-based is old and outdated. It's just that a company the size of Square, who should be the forerunners in this field, haven't given the system a big enough chance yet. After all, wasn't FF13 the last mainline FF to run turn-based? And that's old as hell now. And it's not like even back then the game failed to sell well. You know, this idea that Final Fantasy, if it was turn-based, would not do as well, what is it supported by? And Persona 5, it proved that with enough thought, care to detail, innovation and polish, oh god, I love this game, a turn-based game can still be incredibly successful in today's market. You've just got to give it the right platform, enough backing, enough confidence. And I'm not going to sit speculating the reason why you turned away from turn-based in FF15 Square. Maybe it was genuinely the direction you wanted to take the game, but a strong part of my suspicion is that it's because you lost faith in the viability of turn-based. You were releasing this game at a time when you knew your Japanese console market had died and your new audience was the West, and you felt you had to make some grand big changes. But alas, here we are with Persona 5 destroying your Metacritic score and stealing Best RPG of 2017 straight from your hands. And it's got turn-based combat. You've well and truly, Square, been beaten at your own game. So laying some bare harsh truths out on the line that I typically would want to stay blind to because I'm an overzealous fanboy. But one point I've consistently kept this year, despite being in mad love with 15 and the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole, is that Square need to look to Persona 5 and Nier Automata for inspiration. They need to at this point. What these games did, the bar that these games raised in this year of gaming in terms of combat and story, shouldn't, and I feel confident won't go unnoticed by Square. In fact, these successes, very specifically Persona 5 taking RPG of the Year, that could be the very thing that steers Square Enix away from making FF16 a massively open world action combat game. After all, one huge admission Square have frequently made before these JRPGs landed, before even 15 landed, was that with 15 they looked to Western games for influence. They admitted that. That shit's on record, which, I mean, it seems totally fucked up to me. The goal shouldn't be, Square, to make JRPGs westernized, but to make Westerners fans of JRPGs. I mean, that seems obvious to me, and maybe this will get Square looking for inspiration where I feel they should have been looking all along, which is internally within the JRPG genre. And I think it's worked, because all the talk at Square Enix headquarters since the release of 15, Nier and Persona has taken a pretty noticeable change this year. They aren't talking about Western games as much. I mean, earlier this year, Matsuda himself, Matsuda being Square Enix's head honcho, the CEO and president, said that they wouldn't necessarily make FF16 the way they made 15, even going as far as giving the example that just because 15 was action orientated doesn't mean the next game would. The next entry in the series. And for anyone doubtful that FF16 will ever be a thing, 15 sold Krabby Patties kinda well. Oh yeah, and a month ago Matsuda actually said Final Fantasy series was a series they would never and could never discontinue.
Come on, girl, shake that ass for me. Shake that ass for me. Oh, girl, shake that ass for me. Shake that ass for me. Come on, girl, shake that ass for me. Shake that ass for me. I'm a menace, a dentist, an oral hygienist. Open your mouth for about 4 or 5 minutes. Take a little bit of this fluoride riddance. Swish, but don't spit it. Swallow it now, finish. Yeah, me and Nate, D-O-double-G, looking for a couple bits.
Well, shit, I'm glad about saying. And in this same interview, he started talking about taking FF to its tradition, to its roots, even on the discussion of whether Square have been trying to force games with global appeal over trying to encourage an Eastern taste in Western consumers. So the exact thing I was just referring to, Matsuda got asked, to which he admits that Japanese developers are starkly aware they have a lot of catching up to do, that this debate has been going on at Square Enix headquarters, and quote, there was a generational shift and I will acknowledge that we learned an expensive lesson. A pretty strong admittance of what I was describing earlier, and I think what we all knew, Square have just struggled this generation to adapt. I think that's clear. I think we have to admit they've struggled to adapt in the wake of losing the Japanese market to historically low console sales. And linking that in with one of the latest articles that just came out, the president of Square Enix on Tokyo RPG Factory, the Nintendo Switch, and the future of Square Enix, Matsuda addresses the very question of turn-based combat. And the interview points out to him that they seem to have become less popular in 2017 than they ever have historically, to which the president defends turn-based, saying that younger devs, developers in the Tokyo RPG Factory, are just as interested in making turn-based games, and it's not as generational as we might think it is. Similarly, this kind of, what is perceived as a retro passion or a retro combat system is also loved by a lot of younger devs in the Square Enix organization. Next, when he was talking about the legacy of both Square Enix and the Tokyo Game Factory, both of them, Matsuda admits he really likes turn-based combat, that he sees it as being a part of the legacy of both the company. The individual creativity and freedom that Tokyo Game Factory have way loads more. That's what allows them to make games that they want, that they're passionate about. And Matsuda says going forward they want to impart that same kind of independent creativity and valuing it above all else in the main Square Enix teams. Whether or not that will end up being true, well, I mean, it's fantastic to hear regardless, especially when another point Matsuda made when he was asked what he was most proud of for the Square Enix collective achieving, he answered this. I think overall what I'm most proud of in what they do is how they're taking the established style of gaming, the turn-based style, which is not necessarily an old style, it's just one that's been going for a long time, and really turning that into modern games and making games in that mold for the modern gamer. And I'm really on board with that. I want as many people to play and enjoy those games. I'd like to carry on with that development style in the future. Wow, I think that is about as encouraging a turn-based could return as we're ever going to get, because although Matsuda isn't directly talking about Final Fantasy here, the fact that he has said one of their smallest studios, Tokyo Game Factory, that has a minuscule 10 regular employees, is actually inspiring their games, that's really dope. I also think that if you read this article, Final Fantasy, while not being directly referenced, it's clearly what they're hinting at. I mean, like this, when they're talking about Square making new IPs versus old IPs, quote, obviously we're going to continue making new games, and for the older IPs as well, not just the remakes, remasters we've been doing, we want to create sequels and new games in those series as well. Now, it's fair to say Final Fantasy is quite hyped on the remake remaster train right now. And this wouldn't be the first time sequels have been hinted at lately. A new Ivalice game from the FF12 team has been semi-hinted at. Matsuda himself said we should wait, quote, a while longer to hear about Final Fantasy X-3. And while the Final Fantasy recently did get its sequel, there's been a lot of other talks and rumours and gossips about sequels, so there it is. While I won't get too excited, because Square, they've been notorious these last few years for talking big and then not always delivering, strong hints from CEO Matsuda that the franchise will continue, that there may be sequels on the horizon. They've already said multiple times that FF7 will not be the last remake they do, and some hints that as dead, buried, gone, done and dusted turn-based might seem in the mainline FF, the narrative over at Square isn't as clear-cut, with Matsuda saying he clearly loves turn-based and wants to bring it back for the modern gamer, put it in modern games and work on that in the future. It's possible it could happen, and this doesn't apply only to a single combat system. This isn't just discussion about turn-based. The direction that they steer this franchise as a whole, in this very unfamiliar era of gaming and generation transition that Square Enix have admitted themselves they are struggling with, is stronger now, I think, than it ever has been. I feel like we're stood at the precipice right now with this franchise, and it could go either way. Clearly a lot of discussion about this is happening over at headquarters, and for that reason I think it's important us fans keep this dialogue going, regardless of whether you're extremely passionate, indifferent, or you hate the guts of turn-based combat. It's the dialogue of how much you want your future FF games to be simply built to cater to the taste of the masses, or to give the masses a new taste. And on what is perhaps the most cogent, intelligible thing I have ever said, the fantasy of this video is final. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. I think there's even a new polling system on YouTube where I can stick a poll in the comment section. I might try that. Where do you stand on the turn-based combat debate? Do you ever envision that it can, should, or would return? Yeah, let me know. Until the next video.
go.